The Velthari did not go to war with humanity. That was the first thing their historians would always get wrong. War implied the other side had a chance. What the Velthari did was simpler, cleaner, and, in their minds, far more merciful. They drew a line, a sphere, technically, a perfect shell of sentinel platforms positioned just beyond the orbit of Neptune, invisible to human instruments, silent to human ears, and absolute in its purpose. Nothing would leave the Sol system without Velthari permission. Nothing would enter without Velthari need. Humanity would be left alone to do what primitive civilizations always did: consume, conflict, collapse. The decision had taken 11 minutes of debate in the Grand Convocation, 11 minutes for a species that had been sailing between stars for 40,000 years. The delegate from the Velthari science caste, a long-limbed elder named Osaveth, had presented the case with the quiet authority of someone explaining the weather. Humans, she said, displayed 17 of the 22 markers associated with pre-collapse civilizations. Their neurology was dominated by fear responses. Their political structures were fragmented and self-defeating. Their technology, while advancing at an unusual rate, followed no stable or predictable curve. They were, in the formal language of the convocation, a marginal emergence, interesting enough to observe, dangerous enough to contain, not worthy of contact. The vote was unanimous. That had been 31 years ago. In the cold dark beyond Neptune, the sentinel platforms drifted in their silent orbits, patient as geology, certain as mathematics. They had quarantined 46 civilizations across their long history. 43 had faded within 2 centuries. 2 had stabilized into permanent pre-stellar cultures, content on their home worlds. 1 had achieved a kind of violent self-destruction that the Velthari still studied as a cautionary model. None had ever noticed the line. The Velthari monitoring station designated Outpost Veln 7 maintained a crew of 4. Not because 4 was necessary, a single automated system could have handled the work, but because the Velthari believed organic oversight had value. The crew rotated every 8 years. They watched, they logged, they filed reports that were read by junior analysts in offices 40 light-years away and then archived without action. It was, by any measure, the quietest posting in the Empire. Senior Watcher Darath had been at Veln 7 for 6 years when the alert came. He was in the middle of a meal, reviewing a centuries-old philosophical text on the nature of consciousness, ironic in ways he would only appreciate later, when the system chimed with a tone he had never heard in 6 years of service. Not an alarm, something quieter, more curious. He set down his food and moved to the console. The system had flagged an object crossing the inner boundary of the quarantine sphere, not from outside, from within, from the direction of the 3rd planet. A human vessel. Darath's first instinct was to log it as a malfunction. The humans had no technology capable of reaching this region of space with any precision. Their fastest probes, by the monitoring data, took years to reach the outer planets and carried instruments that could barely distinguish a gas giant from a star at close range. They were, in the most fundamental sense, still learning how to fall upward. But the object was real. The system confirmed it across 4 independent sensors. Small, roughly cylindrical, moving at a speed consistent with a low-thrust ion drive of human design. No life signs, no weapons signatures, no communication bands on any known band. It was just drifting toward the line, slowly, patiently, almost, Darath thought, like it was waiting to be found. He woke the rest of the crew. Protocol required that any contact event, even passive, even from a quarantined world, be handled with full documentation. They gathered around the main display and watched the small human object cross the sentinel threshold and come to a stop. Not a natural stop, a controlled one. It had guidance systems. It knew where it was going. "Should we intercept?" asked Watcher Prell, the youngest of the crew. Darath studied the object for a long moment. It was transmitting nothing, doing nothing, simply sitting there on their side of the line, as though it had delivered a letter and was now waiting politely for someone to open it. "Yes," he said quietly, but carefully. What none of them said, though all of them felt it, was the thing that would haunt Darath for the rest of his life. In 46 quarantines across 40,000 years, no contained civilization had ever found the line. The humans had found it. They had knocked on it. The retrieval took 4 hours. Velthari protocol for handling objects from quarantined worlds was thorough to the point of ritual. The probe was scanned for biological material, for chemical agents, for radiation signatures, for any technology that might interface with Velthari's systems in unexpected ways. It passed every screen. It was, by all measurable standards, inert. A sealed cylinder approximately 2 meters in length, constructed from an aluminum-titanium alloy, its outer surface etched with markings in several human languages and one diagram that Darath recognized immediately. A star map. Specifically, a map showing the position of the human homeworld relative to the sun. He had seen this design before in the historical archives. Humanity had been attaching maps to their space probes for over a century, long before the quarantine, in a gesture that the Velthari xenologists had categorized as either touching or naive, depending on their mood. A species reaching out into the void, announcing itself to whoever might be listening, with no idea that someone already was. But this probe was different. This one had not been launched blindly into open space. It had come here, directly here, to a point in space that had no natural landmark, no gravitational significance, no reason to exist as a destination unless you already knew something was there. The crew opened the canister in the station's containment bay behind 3 layers of shielding, with every monitoring system running at full capacity. Darath half expected nothing, an empty shell perhaps. A mistake, a coincidence of trajectories that his pattern-seeking mind had assembled into intention. What they found, instead, was a library. Not a physical library, a dense data storage medium of human design, far more sophisticated than anything in the monitoring archives from the past decade, loaded with files arranged in a structure that took their translation systems 40 minutes to begin parsing. The files were organized in layers. The outermost layer was simple: mathematical proofs, prime sequences, geometric progressions, the kind of universal language any spacefaring species would recognize, a handshake, a proof of intelligence. The second layer was more complex: linguistics. Not a request for translation, but a gift of one. A carefully constructed key built from overlapping symbolic systems, each one reinforcing the others, designed to allow a reader to bootstrap their way into human language from almost any starting point. Darath had studied xenolinguistics as part of his training. What he was looking at was not the work of a species fumbling toward contact. It was the work of people who had thought very carefully about how minds that had never met could learn to understand each other. "They built us a dictionary," Prell said quietly, "before we even agreed to talk." The third layer took 3 days to open, not because of encryption, but because of volume. It was a record, a history. Not a curated history of the kind civilizations usually presented when making contact, a highlights reel of achievements and culture designed to impress. This was something rawer, messier. Wars and famines and plagues alongside cathedrals and theorems and music, grief sitting next to invention, failure recorded with the same care as triumph. It was, Darath realized slowly, not a message designed to make humanity look good. It was a message designed to make humanity look true. And threaded through the history, woven into it so carefully that he almost missed it at first, was something else. A second record, running parallel to the human history, drawing from different data, written in a different voice. A record of the monitoring, of the transmissions humanity had intercepted for 31 years, of the Velthari signals they had decoded and studied in silence while the Empire watched them through its distant instruments and wrote its patient, dismissive reports. They had known. Not everything. Not the details of the quarantine decision or the specifics of Velthari civilization, but the shape of it, the presence of it, the fact of it. For 31 years, humanity had known it was being watched and said nothing, had continued its wars and its politics and its art and its science, had kept building and arguing and grieving and discovering, and somewhere in the background, quietly, without announcement, had been listening back. The final file in the third layer was a single document, short, 11 paragraphs. Written in clean, careful language that the translation system rendered with surprising precision. Durath read it 3 times before he trusted his understanding. It was not a plea. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was an argument, addressed to whoever had built the line. He sent the full contents to the Empire with the highest priority flag available to a station of Veln 17's classification. Then he sat alone in the monitoring room, in the dark, reading those 11 paragraphs again. Outside, the human probe drifted in perfect stillness against the stars, waiting still. The argument had no title. It began with a statement of fact. We know you are there. We have known for some time. We do not know your name or your appearance or the history that made you what you are, but we know you are watching us, and we know you have decided for reasons that seem correct to you, that we are not ready. The second paragraph. We are not writing to tell you that you are wrong. We are writing because we think the question of whether we are ready is the wrong question. Darath had flagged those 2 paragraphs in his report. His superiors had flagged them in theirs. By the time the document reached the desk of the Convocation's Contact Ethics Division, a department that had processed exactly 1 inquiry in the past decade, and that a procedural one, it had been read by 41 Velthari across 11 different departments. Every one of them had flagged the same 2 paragraphs. The document continued. It acknowledged the logic of the quarantine. It laid out with uncomfortable precision the markers the Velthari used to classify civilizations, deduced from decades of intercepted scientific and administrative transmissions. It acknowledged that humanity met most of them. It did not dispute the data. What it disputed was the interpretation. You measure instability, the document said, as though instability is a direction, as though a species that has not yet found peace is moving away from it. But we have studied our own history, and we can tell you something you cannot see from where you are standing. Our instability is not decay. It is argument. We fight because we disagree. We disagree because we think. And we think, all of us, all the time about everything, including what is right, including what we owe each other, including what kind of species we want to become. No civilization that has stopped arguing has ever gotten better. The Contact Ethics Division convened an emergency session. It was not an emergency by any bureaucratic definition. No shots had been fired, no borders had been crossed, no treaty had been violated. But the session was called emergency because no one in the room knew the correct protocol for what was happening, and in the absence of procedure, urgency seemed like a reasonable substitute. The arguments ran for 6 hours. The conservative position was simple. The quarantine held. The probe was an anomaly. The document was sophisticated, yes, but sophistication was not wisdom, and cleverness was not readiness. The humans had found the line, which was unexpected, but finding a fence did not mean you had earned the right to open the gate. The opposing position was harder to articulate, but harder to dismiss. One delegate, a senior ethicist named Vorath, who had spent 30 years studying the collapse patterns of failed civilizations, kept returning to a single point. Every civilization the Velthari had quarantined and watched collapse had shown one consistent trait in its final century. It had stopped producing new frameworks for thinking about itself. It had calcified. It had decided it already knew what it was. Humanity, she argued, had not decided anything of the sort. As if to prove her point, the document's 7th paragraph had included a passage that the translation system had flagged as unusually difficult to render, not because the language was complex, but because the concept kept slipping between Velthari frameworks without settling into any of them. The passage read, "We are not asking you to trust us. We understand why you don't. We are asking you to consider the possibility that a species which knows it cannot be trusted and says so plainly, and shows you its whole ugly history without apology, and still reaches across the dark to knock on your door, that such a species might be worth talking to, not because we are good, but because we are trying, and because trying, for us, is what being alive means." The session ended without a formal decision. That in itself was a decision of a kind. Bureaucracies in motion tend to stay in motion. Bureaucracies that pause tend to shift. Back at Veln 7, Daroth received no instructions. He continued logging. He continued watching. He wrote, in his personal notes rather than his official report, something he would later expand into a paper that quietly reshaped Velthari xenological thinking over the following generation. "We classified them by their conflicts," he wrote. "We should have classified them by what their conflicts were about. There is a profound difference between a species that fights over resources and one that fights over ideas. One is consuming itself. The other is becoming itself." The human probe continued to wait at the edge of the quarantine line, its small systems ticking over patiently in the dark, its data delivered, its argument made, nothing left to do but exist and let the universe decide what happened next. 41 days after the document reached the convocation, a narrow-beam transmission was sent from a Velthari relay station toward the Sol system. It carried no diplomatic language, no formal greeting, no statement of policy. It carried a single file, a dictionary, written in human language, defining, one careful entry at a time, the words of the Velthari tongue. The response from Earth came back in 19 hours, faster than the Velthari expected, which told them something. It was a single line, rendered in careful, imperfect Velthari script, clearly the work of people who had been attempting the language for far less time than the dictionary assumed. "We thought you would never answer. We kept writing anyway. That is what we do." Daroth read the line in the monitoring room at 3 a.m. station time, alone, the stars outside the viewport unchanged and indifferent. He sat with it for a long while. Then he did something that was not in any protocol, not in any log he ever filed. He smiled. Because 40,000 years of watching civilizations rise and fall gave the Velthari enormous wisdom about what a species looked like at its end. But very little, it turned out, about what one looked like at its beginning. Humanity had been dismissed as a species too broken to matter. They had responded by sending their brokenness in full and asking to be understood anyway. And the universe, for once, had listened. The smallest things, it turned out, had the longest reach. The dictionary changed everything and nothing at the same time. On the Velthari side, the Contact Ethics Division found itself buried under competing directives. The Science Cast wanted access to human research networks. The Military Oversight Bureau wanted the quarantine maintained until a formal threat assessment was completed, a process they estimated would take between 12 and 40 years depending on resource allocation. The Philosophical Accord, an institution old enough that most Velthari forgot it still had formal authority, issued a quiet opinion that the quarantine had been ethically compromised the moment humanity demonstrated awareness of it, and that continuing it constituted, in their precise and ancient language, a deception without consent. The opinion caused 3 days of argument and then was largely set aside. Bureaucracies, even alien ones, prefer the familiar to the correct. On Earth, the dictionary caused something entirely different. It did not stay secret. Nothing on Earth ever stayed secret for long, a fact the Velthari monitoring system had documented in exhaustive detail over 3 decades. Within 72 hours of the first linguists confirming what they had received, the information had moved through 17 channels and was being discussed in 6 languages by people who had no official knowledge of the contact program. Within a week, it was public. Not officially public, no government made an announcement, no press conference was called, no statement was released, but it was known. The way things become known on a world where 8 billion people are all talking to each other constantly across every border and time zone and political division, sharing and arguing and verifying and doubting, and ultimately, haltingly, arriving at the truth. Humanity learned it was not alone. And then humanity did the thing the Velthari had not modeled for. It kept going. There was no mass panic, no global paralysis. There were arguments, of course, furious ones, in parliaments and universities and living rooms and comment sections about what it meant and what should be done and who had the right to speak for the species and whether humanity had any business opening a conversation it wasn't prepared to finish. There were people who were afraid. There were people who were angry. There were people who felt the quarantine as a profound insult and wanted to respond in kind. But underneath all of it, thrumming through the noise like a bass note, was something else, something the monitoring system's sociological models had rated as a secondary trait, a minor characteristic, easily overwhelmed by fear responses in high-stakes scenarios: curiosity. Not the mild, ambient curiosity of a comfortable species, the sharp, specific, almost aggressive curiosity of a species that had spent its entire history asking questions about a universe that didn't explain itself, and had learned that the only thing worse than not knowing the answer was not asking the question. The linguists who had received the Velthari dictionary worked without sleep for 70 hours and produced a preliminary response document that was, by any clinical measure, far too long, far too personal, and far too full of questions. It violated every principle of cautious first contact protocol that the small, unofficial team had agreed on beforehand. It was sent anyway, because the person who finished writing it at 4 a.m. looked at it and decided that sending something real was better than sending something careful, and the 2 people who were supposed to approve it before transmission looked at it and agreed. The Velthari received a response that asked 47 questions. The monitoring station at Veln 7, now staffed with an expanded crew of 12 and carrying new equipment rushed out from the nearest military depot, processed the transmission and forwarded it to the contact division with a note from Darath, who had been retained as senior advisor despite his rotation technically having ended 2 months prior. His note said only, "They are not negotiating, they are learning. Recommend treating these as separate processes." No one at the contact division was sure what to do with that recommendation. It didn't fit any existing framework. That, it was becoming clear, was going to be a recurring problem. The Velthari had enormous experience with contact situations. They had protocols for hostile civilizations, for passive ones, for civilizations that lied and civilizations that were naive, and civilizations so alien in their cognition that communication took generations. They had protocols for every type of emergence they had ever observed. They had no protocol for a species that argued with itself constantly and loudly and apparently productively, that had multiple contradictory positions on every question simultaneously, that could not agree who spoke for it and somehow kept speaking anyway, that sent a response containing 47 genuine questions to an interstellar communication because the people writing it couldn't bear to pretend they didn't want to know. One junior analyst in the contact division, working late on the preliminary assessment, wrote in her personal log, "I think we may have made an error. Not a moral error, not yet. I understand why the quarantine was drawn, but a taxonomical one. We placed them in the wrong category. We looked at all the ways they are divided and classified them as unstable. But their divisions are not fractures. They are load-bearing. They hold something up." She didn't include that in her official report. She wasn't sure it would be understood. She wasn't entirely sure she understood it herself. But the question wouldn't let her go.
It was Vorath, the senior ethicist, who finally forced the conversation that the convocation had been carefully avoiding. She requested a formal session of the full convocation, not the contact division, not a subcommittee, but the whole body, all 47 delegates from all 11 castes, the kind of gathering that happened perhaps twice in a generation. The request took 6 days to approve, which by Velthari standards was nearly instantaneous, a fact that told Vorath everything she needed to know about how worried people already were. She spoke for 2 hours without notes. She began with the history, not the history of contact protocols, which everyone in the room knew by heart, but the history of the quarantine program itself. She walked them through all 46 cases. She named every civilization. She read their classification reports. She read their ending reports, the dry procedural documents that recorded the moment monitoring had determined a civilization had crossed the threshold of irreversible decline. Some took decades, some took centuries. Each report used the same formal language, the same measured tone, the same careful avoidance of anything that might sound like regret. The room was very quiet by the time she finished the list. Then she said, "In 47 cases, we decided a civilization was not ready for us. In 47 cases, we were right about one thing. They never contacted us. They never found the line. They never sent us a message. They declined or collapsed or faded, and we watched, and we documented, and we moved on. We told ourselves this was wisdom. We told ourselves it was mercy." She paused. The 47th civilization found the line, sent us a probe, sent us their history, all of it, not the good parts, all of it, made us a dictionary before we agreed to speak, asked us 47 questions in their first reply because they apparently cannot help wanting to know things. Another pause. And we are sitting here debating whether to continue a quarantine that they are already aware of toward a species that has demonstrated more genuine intellectual reaching in 31 years of silent observation than most of our contact cases showed in their entire documented histories. A delegate from the military bureau said the obvious thing. The 47 questions included several about Velthari propulsion systems. This, he suggested, was concerning. Vorath looked at him for a long moment. They also asked, she said, about grief, Specifically, they asked whether Velthari experience grief, how it manifests, and whether it changes over time. They asked because they said they wanted to understand us, not just our ships. She let that sit. I am not suggesting we answer the propulsion questions. I am suggesting we consider what kind of species asks both kinds of questions in the same document. The debate that followed lasted 4 days. What came out of it was not a clean resolution. The Velthari were not, whatever their reputation for order, a species that produced clean resolutions. What came out was a compromise structured around a new category, one that had never existed in their xenological taxonomy before. Not marginal emergence, not full contact candidate, something they spent 2 weeks naming because the name mattered, and they knew it. They called it Vernith, which translated roughly as a thing in the process of becoming what it will be. A civilization not yet ready for full contact, but too aware, too reaching, too genuinely engaged with its own becoming to be quarantined in good conscience. The quarantine sphere would remain, but it would no longer be maintained as a barrier. It would be maintained as a boundary, a line both sides knew existed, that could be approached and communicated across, that would hold until both species agreed it no longer needed. Dareth received the new directive at Veln 7 and read it 3 times. Then he drafted the formal notification to be transmitted toward Earth, a document that the Contact Division had agonized over for a week, that had been revised 11 times, that was measured and precise and diplomatic in ways that the human document had not been. He sent it. Then, without filing it, without logging it, he drafted a second transmission, personal, informal, not a violation of any rule, because no rule had anticipated a situation in which a monitoring station officer might feel he owed something to the civilization he had been watching. It was short, 7 sentences. It explained in plain terms, rather than diplomatic language, what the new category meant and how it came to exist. It told them, without bureaucratic framing, that they had changed something, not the border, something harder to name than that. He sent it before he could think better of it. Earth's response came back in just under 20 hours. It was addressed to him personally. It said, "We had a word for what you described. For a long time we used it to mean the waiting period before something good happened, but the older meaning is better. It means the change itself, the becoming. We call it becoming too. We just couldn't agree on how long it was supposed to take. We are glad you told us." Dareth filed the exchange in his personal archive he had been quietly maintaining since the probe arrived. He labeled the file with a single word that was not Velthari. He had learned it from the dictionary. Vernith.
The existence of the Velthari, or rather, the existence of confirmed communicating alien intelligence, did not transform human civilization overnight. This surprised a significant portion of the Velthari analysis community, which had modeled for dramatic societal disruption. The models had predicted economic volatility, political fragmentation, widespread existential crisis. They had rated the probability of a stable social response below 20%. The models had been wrong. Not because humanity wasn't disrupted, it was, profoundly, in ways both visible and slow-moving, but because disruption was not the same as destabilization. And the Velthari, it turned out, had been measuring the wrong variable again. What actually happened was quieter and stranger, and in retrospect more significant than any of the crisis scenarios. Humanity began, collectively and without coordination, to look outward in a way it hadn't quite done before. Not just the governments or the scientists or the linguists who were formally involved in what was being called in 7 different languages by 7 different unofficial names, the exchange. Everyone.
Teachers redesigned curricula, not because they were told to, but because children were asking questions that the old curricula didn't address. Artists began producing work that tried to imagine what it meant to exist in a universe that had always been inhabited. Philosophers who had spent careers debating whether contact with alien intelligence would be possible began debating instead what it meant that it had happened, what obligations followed from it, what it changed about the most fundamental questions of human self-understanding. And quietly, in laboratories and universities and research institutes on 6 continents, scientists who had spent their careers on work that had no obvious application to anything beyond the edge of the solar system began without announcement or coordination to redirect. Not because there was funding for it, there wasn't, not yet. Not because there was a program, there wasn't, not yet. But because the universe had just told them in the most unmistakable way possible that the things they had been studying in theoretical isolation were not theoretical anymore, and the distance between a question and its answer had suddenly, vertiginously collapsed. The Velthari monitoring team watched all of this unfold over the following 18 months and produced a series of reports that were collectively the most argued over documents in the Contact Division's history. The first report noted that human social cohesion, measured across 17 standard indicators, had not declined following the contact confirmation. Several indicators had improved marginally. This was rated as anomalous and flagged for further study. The second report noted that human technological development, already advancing at an unusual rate, had accelerated in 3 specific areas: long-range sensing, material science, and what the analysts initially misclassified as theoretical mathematics before realizing it was something more applied. The humans were working on something. The monitoring instruments couldn't quite resolve what. The third report was the one that caused a formal review at the highest level of the Velthari Science Administration because it contained a finding that none of the analysts were comfortable putting in plain language, but that all of them individually and then collectively had confirmed. Humanity had been studying the Sentinel platforms. Not discovering them, they had clearly discovered them some time ago, as the probe had demonstrated. Studying them. Specifically their power signatures, their orbital mechanics, and, the analysts wrote this sentence and then checked it 4 times before leaving it in, their material composition, which human instruments should not have been able to determine from within the quarantine sphere, but which the monitoring data suggested they had been working backward to model from gravitational microlensing data over a period of approximately 7 years. They had not attempted to interfere with the platforms. They had not, as far as monitoring could determine, communicated the findings to their governments in any actionable way. They had simply studied, patiently, methodically, the way a species that had spent centuries building its understanding of the universe, one careful observation at a time, might study anything it found mysterious and near and too important to ignore. Durath read the third report and felt the familiar sensation that had been following him since the probe first crossed the threshold. Not alarm, something more complicated. Something that required, he was discovering, human vocabulary to name precisely. The humans had been studying the Watchers, not as a counter-strategy, not as an act of aggression, but because that was what they did. Because they found things they didn't understand and they looked at them hard and long and carefully until they understood a little more. Because they could not, apparently, be in proximity to a mystery without trying to solve it, even when the mystery was the wall of their own cage. He sent a personal note to Durath, who had been quietly elevated to lead a new working group on what the Velthari were now internally calling the human question. His note was 4 sentences long. They are not studying the platforms to escape. I do not believe that is their intention. I believe they are studying them for the same reason they sent the probe, the same reason they wrote the argument, the same reason they asked 47 questions instead of 1. Because they need to understand where they are. That is a different thing from wanting to leave. Veraf's response came back in 6 hours. She had appended 3 words to his note. I know. I know. 2 years after the probe crossed the quarantine line, the Velthari Convocation voted on the formal recognition of humanity's Verneth status. The vote was not unanimous. 14 delegates voted against, mostly from the military bureau and the older branches of the administrative caste, on grounds that were reasonable and consistent with 4,000 years of established doctrine. They were not wrong by the standards they had always used. That was, in some ways, the most sobering part. The yes votes prevailed 33 to 14. The formal document that followed was long, as Velthari formal documents always were, dense with precedent and qualification and careful language. But it contained in its 12th section a passage that Vorath had insisted on and that had been debated 17 times before it was accepted. In plain translation, it read, "The civilization of Earth is not recognized as ready for full integration with the wider community of known species. It is recognized as something rarer and more significant, a civilization in the act of becoming, whose trajectory cannot be predicted, whose internal conflicts do not indicate decay, and whose manner of reaching across the unknown demonstrates a quality for which our taxonomy has historically had no adequate term. We recognize, in formally categorizing this civilization, that our categories may be insufficient. This document is therefore also an acknowledgement of our own limitation, offered in the spirit in which we were first contacted, honestly, without full understanding, and with the intention of learning." Derath, who was now officially assigned to the Earth Liaison Project and had spent 2 years in closer contact with human communication than any Velthari in history, read the passage 3 times. Then he transmitted it to the small human team that had become his primary counterparts. 5 linguists and 2 scientists and 1 philosopher who had somehow become essential to the exchange without anyone formally appointing her. The philosopher, a woman named Irini Vasquez, who wrote with a precision and warmth that the translation system handled better than almost any human voice, responded within the hour. Her response was not to the formal document. It was to the passage from the 12th section, specifically to the phrase that acknowledged Velthari limitation. She wrote, "This is the part that matters most, not the recognition. Recognition can be given and taken by the ones with the power to do both. What matters is that you acknowledged not knowing, that you let your own uncertainty into the official document. That takes more courage than a quarantine. We know. We've tried it ourselves." Derath thought about this for a long time. The exchange continued, slowly, carefully, with misunderstandings that sometimes took weeks to untangle and breakthroughs that sometimes came from the most unexpected directions. The Velthari shared, cautiously, some of what they knew. The humans shared, characteristically not cautiously at all, enormous amounts of what they knew, including things no one had asked for and things that the analysts flagged as potentially sensitive, and things that were simply beautiful: music, mathematics, stories, arguments, expressions of grief and joy and uncertainty and conviction sent across the dark in the apparent genuine belief that beauty was worth sharing, even between strangers. The Sentinel platforms remained. Both sides agreed, in a rare moment of simple alignment, that removing them too quickly would create a security uncertainty that served neither party. The boundary was real. It would stay real for a while. But it was a different kind of boundary now. Months after the Verneth vote, a young Velthari analyst named Peleth, recently assigned to the monitoring team and still new enough to ask the questions that more experienced staff had stopped asking, submitted an informal query to Derath. She had been reviewing the historical file on the probe and had come across the original alert from 6 years prior. She wanted to know, at the moment the probe crossed the line, In the first minutes before retrieval, what had Darath actually believed he was looking at? He thought about his answer for a full day before sending it. "I believed," he wrote, "that it was a mistake, that a primitive species had accidentally sent a probe in our direction, and we were watching it drift across a boundary it couldn't see and didn't know existed. That is what the data should have indicated. That is what all our models, all our history, all our 46 previous cases prepared me to expect." What it actually was, a choice, made by beings who had known for years that something was watching them, who had decided, without knowing what that something was, or whether it would respond, or whether response was even possible, to knock anyway. I have thought about that choice every day since. I have thought about what it requires to knock on a door you cannot see, held by hands you have never met, in a dark you cannot cross. What kind of being does that? I know what kind now. The kind that understands that the only unforgivable thing is silence. The kind that reaches not because it is certain it will be met, but because reaching is what being alive means to them. They told us that in the 11th paragraph of the first document. We did not understand it then. I think I am only beginning to understand it now. He sent the response and returned to his work. Outside the viewport of the station, which had been upgraded and expanded, and now home to 31 crew members from 4 different divisions, the stars were the same as they had always been. The quarantine sphere turned in the dark, its platforms patient and cold, and holding a boundary that meant something different than it used to. And somewhere on the other side of it, on a small planet around an unremarkable star, 8 billion people were going about the ordinary business of being human, arguing, building, grieving, discovering, fighting about the wrong things, and sometimes, in the spaces between, stumbling toward the right ones. They didn't know what the Velthari knew. They didn't have what the Velthari had. They were, by almost any objective measure, younger and smaller and less in almost every category that the Empire had ever measured worth. But they had knocked on a door they couldn't see, and the universe, 40,000 years into the project of watching civilizations rise and fall, had found itself unable to look away. Not because humanity was the strongest thing in the dark, because it was the most stubbornly, irreducibly, magnificently alive. And it had proven, across 31 years of silence and 1 perfectly aimed probe, and 11 paragraphs, and 47 questions, and a dictionary, and a word they had borrowed across the stars, that being alive, really alive, questioningly and painfully and insatiably alive, was the one thing no quarantine could ever contain. The stars don't move for the powerful. They move for the ones who refuse to stop reaching.